99.5 KKLA Los Angeles and on the web at kkla.com. This is the Frank Sontag Show. There are many worldly questions that we are confronted with in this life. Who and why are we here? What's our purpose? Along the lines of faith, is Christianity true? Does God really exist? And if he does, how can so many horrible things happen in this life? We're going to talk about some of these questions, tantamount to struggles in life and reason and purpose. And with me is one of our greatest. He is research professor of philosophy at Biola University's Talbot School of Theology. He's authored over and edited over 30 books. Dr. William Lane Craig, welcome to the Frank Sontag Show here on 99.5 KKLA.
Thank you, Frank. Good to be with you.
You as well, William. Good to hear your voice. Let's just go right out of the gate with one of the bigger questions in life. I just interviewed a woman who was a human rights activist for 30-some years. She has a book. She struggled with faith because of all of the horrible things that we see in this life. So the question is, William, if God really exists, how can these horrible things be happening?
I think what we have to say as Christians is that God only allows horrible things to happen with a view towards some greater good in mind, so that God has morally sufficient reasons for permitting the evils and the suffering in the world. And these reasons may not become evident to us during our lifetime. There's no reason to think that we ought to be able to discern the ultimate reasons for which God allows suffering and evil in the world. But I don't think there's any way the atheist can prove that he doesn't have them. And as Christians, we believe that he does.
Atheism is popular, at least it seems like the secular world says that and promotes that. Along the lines of defending our faith, what are some of the ways in which we can share our faith in a very relationship-oriented way to people that say there is no God?
Well, I think, first of all, we want to be good listeners. We want to ask them why they believe that, ask them to give their reasons. And what I find is that most of the time unbelievers haven't thought very deeply about these questions, and that their unbelief is really emotionally based rather than rationally based. And I think it's important to make that clear, that they really don't have any good reason for what they believe. Now, that requires you then, on the reflex move, to be able to offer some positive reasons for why you think that God does exist. And in my published work, I've defended a number of these arguments for the existence of God that I think are good reasons to believe that there is a creator and designer of the universe who is the paradigm of absolute goodness and has revealed himself in Jesus of Nazareth.
Can you share some of those now for those of us listening and are interested?
Let me just list them. We could talk about them in detail if you care to. I think that God is the best explanation of why anything exists rather than nothing. He's the best explanation of the origin of the universe at a point in the finite past. He's the best explanation of the fine-tuning of the universe for intelligent life. God is the best explanation for the existence of objective moral values and duties in the world. I think God is the best explanation for the historical facts concerning the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. And finally, I think God can be personally known and experienced. And so I think those reasons present a very powerful cumulative case for thinking that, in fact, there is such a person as God.
I liked what you said just a few moments ago about thinking things through and maybe save emotions and feelings. Any general comment about our unwillingness maybe between sinful activities and the wrong view of God, not being willing to fully embrace his gifts, what he's given us, and live these sinful lives?
Well, that would be a reflection probably of living out of pure self-interest, and that obviously is something that nature rather builds into us. It takes moral character and strength to resist self-interest and put the interests of others and of what's right in front of self. That's hard to do. And so The lazy way, the easy way, is to just go with self-interest and self-desire and not to do the good thing, the right thing.
Not to do the good thing, the right thing, but yet that's the way of the world.
Right. That's true. If you just follow your own self-interest, then you're going to elevate that above others, above what God wants you to do, and ultimately even above conscience and what you think is right and wrong, because very often conscience and the moral thing will be in conflict with pure self-interest. And it's hard to do something that isn't in your own self-interest just because you believe that it's right.
William Lane Craig is with us. He is professor of philosophy at Biola University's Talbot School of Theology. So that being said, William, here's the crux of a perspective of history and life. Something happened 2,000 years ago that changed human history in the form of the crucifixion and the resurrection. Can you talk about the resurrection, please?
Yes. I did my doctoral work in Munich on the historicity of Jesus' resurrection, and what I was astonished, frankly, to discover was that the historical foundations for that event are very credible and acknowledged by most New Testament historians who have written on that subject. And I would summarize these as three independent facts. Number one, that after his crucifixion, Jesus was buried in a tomb by Joseph of Arimathea. Second, that thereafter that tomb was discovered empty by a group of his women followers on the first day of the week after his crucifixion. Thirdly, that thereafter various individuals and groups of people saw appearances of Jesus alive from the dead, and these original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that God had raised Jesus from the dead despite every predisposition to the contrary. Those facts are part of the historical Jesus that are agreed upon by the majority of scholars who have written on the subject. And I would argue that there's no better explanation of those facts than the one that these original men gave, namely that God raised Jesus from the dead.
And yet there are so many that say there's different theories on the resurrection and what happened in the view of the attempt to maybe undermine the truth of who God is and the triune God and what he did for us at the cross.
Well, really, honestly, there really aren't that many people of a scholarly nature that would defend these alternative theories. There's almost nobody among New Testament historians or scholars who would defend things like the conspiracy theory or the apparent death theory or the wrong tomb theory. There are a couple that would defend the hallucination theory, but for the most part, that's not where the debate lies. It's generally acknowledged that there just isn't any plausible naturalistic explanation of those facts. Rather, those who do not agree with the resurrection of Jesus as the best explanation tend to simply be agnostic about it. They simply say, we don't know what happened. As you put it, something incredible happened in the middle of the first century that generated this movement that today we call Christianity. But they would say, we don't know what it was.
William Lane Craig is with us. We are talking about, for all intents and purposes, basic fundamentals of the Christian faith. When we continue with Dr. Craig, the consequences of life without God. We'll talk about that next here on the Frank Sontag Show on 99.5 KKLA, where we invite you to tune in weekends, Sundays at 6 for the Christian Outlook. It's a program that not only teaches you how to think as Christian, but talks about some of the events that are happening throughout our country. Join us at 6 o'clock Sunday evenings for the Christian Outlook here on 99.5 KKLA. .5 KKLA, this is the Frank Sontag Show. We're talking about basic fundamentals of Christian faith. God, the resurrection, cosmological arguments for and against, with my guest, Dr. William Lane Craig, who is research professor of philosophy at Biola University. Dr. Craig, you have spoken and written a great deal about the consequences of a life without God. And again, there's a part of the world that believes still or rebels against our very Father and the idea that there is indeed one true God. Can you talk about some of the consequences of that life without Him?
Well, I think it's really, really important, Frank, that we clarify what is meant when you say life without God. I am not talking about a life that is lived without belief in God. We're not talking about the necessity of believing in God. We're talking about what are the logical consequences of atheism. That is to say, if there is no God, then what are the logical consequences for human beings? And it seems to me that if God does not exist, if there is no such being as God, then basically we are just relatively advanced primates that have evolved on this tiny speck of dust, lost in a hostile and mindless universe, and which are doomed to perish individually and collectively in a relatively short time. So that on an atheistic view, really there is no ultimate or objective meaning to life. There is no objective value to life. There is no objective purpose to life. Insofar as people manage to live meaningful, purposeful, and valuable lives, these are purely subjective. That is to say, in essence, they're just human delusions that we invent or make up or are ingrained into us by evolution in order for us to get by in life. But really, objectively speaking, it seems to me that on atheism there is no ultimate meaning, value, or purpose in life. And this is a conclusion which is not mine alone. This is what a good many atheist thinkers themselves believe. People like Nietzsche, Russell, Sartre, and others acknowledge that these are the consequences of an atheistic worldview.
Can you talk about relativistic views of life versus absolute truth?
Well, I don't like to use the word absolute. I think that is prone to misunderstanding. I like to use the word objective as opposed to subjective. Subjective means it's just a matter of human opinion. Objective means that it's true and valid independently of human opinion. It holds whether anybody believes in it or not. And so the argument is that in the absence of God, if God doesn't exist, then things like meaning, value, and purpose in life are not objective realities. They're just subjective byproducts of human opinion.
If God doesn't exist, life is futile.
Yes.
When we talk about the horrors that we are capable of as human beings, I know I've listened to many of your lectures, one in particular that I listened to get my certificates program in apologetics at Biola. It was called The Absurdity of Life Without God, and you made the comparison about Mother Teresa versus Hitler. Can you talk about that perspective, if you will?
Yeah, actually, that illustration was borrowed from my colleague, J.P. Moreland, so I want to give due credit to him. What Moreland says is that if God does not exist, if there are no objective values in life, then the decision to become a Mother Teresa rather than a Joseph Stalin is just arbitrary. It's like choosing to go to McDonald's rather than Burger King. There really isn't any objective moral difference between the two. It's just a matter of arbitrary personal preference, which seems unconscionable.
Yeah, I was going to say, not only make it unconscionable, but Dr. Craig, you make it sound so clear, and yet there are some of us that say no. Some of us that say, look, I'm okay with your faith as long as you don't infringe on my faith. And I mean, you know that world. You've argued against atheism for a good chunk of your life.
Well, I think that what these folks sense correctly is that there really are objective moral values and purpose in life. They want to say, wait a minute, there is objective value, there is objective purpose. I sense it, I experience it. And I want to say, yes, that's right. That doesn't refute anything that I've said. In fact, that provides the missing premise in an argument for God's existence. Here's how the argument would go. Premise one, if God does not exist, then life has no objective meaning, value, or purpose. Premise two, but life does have objective meaning, value, and purpose. And what follows from that? Three, therefore, God exists. So that doesn't refute anything I've said. On the contrary, it furnishes the missing premise that provides for a sound argument for God's existence.
Dr. William Lane Craig is with us. He is professor of philosophy at Biola University's Talbot School of Theology. We're going to open the phone lines in just a little while. Dr. Craig, before I ask you about your life and when you did come to Christ, I know it was very early, and I think the story is very profound and worth talking about. You told a story, and I don't remember when I heard it in one of the lectures, but you talked about Nietzsche's story of the madman seeking God.
Yeah.
Can you share that story, please?
Well, this is from Friedrich Nietzsche, the great 19th century atheist who proclaimed the death of God. And he compares this announcement to a madman who comes into the marketplace in the early morning hours carrying a lantern, crying, where is God? Where is God? And the people standing around laugh and mock him and so forth. And finally, he says, where is God? I'll tell you, we have killed him. You and I, all of us are his murderers. But then he goes on to say, how have we managed to do this? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? What did we do when we loosed this earth from its sun? Whither is it moving now in all directions? Is there any up or down left? And he explains the terrible consequences of atheism. And then the crowd just looks at him in astonishment and silence. They're speechless. And at last he dashes the lantern to the ground, and he said, I have come too early. This news is still on its way. It has not yet reached the ears of men. And what Nietzsche meant by that parable was people didn't yet comprehend the terrible consequences of the death of God or of atheism. And if they really did understand the logical implications of atheism, they would be like that madman crying out in despair and anguish over what had happened.
So from the time of Nietzsche's story of that madman till now, have we learned any more? Are we any closer to really understanding it as a humanity?
Well, some philosophers have. As I mentioned, people like the great Bertrand Russell or the French existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre, or many naturalists today like Joel Marx or Alex Rosenberg. These philosophers have the courage to stare atheism in the face and not blink. And they will admit the logical consequences of their own atheism. But for many, many others, Frank, they don't have the courage to do that, and they blink, and they affirm values anyway. Francis Schaeffer called this leaping from the lower story to the upper story. Yes. He says modern man lives in a two-story universe, where in the upper story is God, meaning, value, and purpose. But modern man lives in the lower story, where it's just the material world. And there is no meaning, value, or purpose there. And modern man is unable to live consistently and happily in the lower story. And so he makes leaps of faith into the upper story to affirm meaning, value, and purpose for his life, even though he has no basis for such a leap, since in the lower story, God does not exist.
Dr. William Lane Craig is my guest from Biola University. His area of expertise is theology. He is a research professor of philosophy and does one of the many areas of his life, does some of his work at Talbot School of Theology at Biola at La Mirada. We're going to open the phone lines to you. If you have any questions for Dr. Craig, the numbers are always the same, 888-995-KKLA, 888-995-KKLA. Any questions or comments for my guest, William Lane Craig? And when we return with your phone calls, we're going to talk about when Dr. Craig came to know Jesus Christ in his life. That is next here on the Frank Sontag Show. 99.5 KKLA, this is the Frank Sontag Show. My guest is Dr. William Lane Craig. He is a research professor of philosophy. We know him from Biola University's Talbot School of Theology. I just found off all the air. William, should I talk about our baseball conversation for 10 seconds here?
Okay.
I mentioned to you, you should drive to the KKLA studio sometime here in Glendale, and you said that's a long drive from Atlanta, Georgia. And then you made mention of the Dodgers and the Braves are playing right now.
Right. The Braves were ahead when we started this interview, and I have no idea where they are now.
Well, we won't ask who you're pulling for. We'll just assume you've kind of bipartisan. You like the Dodgers and the Braves.
Okay.
Okay. You have not always known Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, or at least in the active step of surrendering your life to His. Can you talk about your childhood and if and when that did happen along those lines in those early days?
Sure. I wasn't raised in a Christian home, though it was a good, loving home. We weren't even a church-going family. But when I became a teenager, I began to ask the big questions in life. Why am I here? What's the purpose of my existence, and so forth. And I felt deeply the sort of darkness and despair that we talked about earlier in this interview. And I was miserable. And I walked into my high school German class one day and sat down behind a girl who's one of these types, you know, that is always so happy that it just makes you sick. Yeah. And I tapped her on the shoulder and I said, "Sandy, what are you always so happy about anyway?" And she said, "Well, it's because I know Jesus Christ is my personal Savior." And I said, "Well, what does that mean?" And she said, "You've got to have Him living in your heart, Bill." And I said, "Well, why would He want to do a thing like that?" And she said, "Because He loves you, Bill." And that just hit me like a ton of bricks. Here I was, so filled with anguish and despair, and she said that there was someone who really loved me. And who was it but the God of the universe? And that thought just staggered me. I'd never heard that before. And that lit a fire under me. I went home that night and I found a New Testament that had been given to me in the 5th grade by the Gideons when they visited our grade school. And I started reading it, and I was absolutely captivated by the person of Jesus of Nazareth. There was a ring of wisdom, a ring of truth, rather, about this man's words, a wisdom that I couldn't explain. And there was an authenticity about his life that was undeniable. Well, that set me on a soul search that lasted about the next 6 months. And at the end of those 6 months, I just came to the end of my rope and yielded my life to Christ and experienced a tremendous surge of joy as I was filled with the Holy Spirit, and God became a living reality in my life. And that was the turnaround that occurred to me when I was 16 years old.
And then from then on, you decided academically to pursue Him in not only your understanding and your personal life, but in your abilities that He has given you.
Yes.
You chose to also teach us about Him.
Well, I was always gifted academically as opposed to athletically. And during those 6 months, I realized that if this were really the truth, that I could do nothing less than devote my entire life to spreading this message among mankind, because this is the greatest news ever announced. And so when I went off to college, my studies and my faith were integrated together in trying to formulate a Christian worldview with a Christian perspective on the arts, on the sciences, on philosophy, on history, on literature, and so forth. And it was there that I was seized with this vision of presenting the gospel in the context of giving an intellectual defense of the Christian world and life view. And that's what I've been about ever since.
Mm. When you look at some of the young men and women that you teach, maybe early on versus now, I imagine you sense God's presence, and yet we have a world that is still, and we know, a world that is bent against Him. Do you love teaching?
Well, no, that's a loaded question. I enjoy teaching briefly, But I found I did not enjoy full-time teaching. I taught seminary for 7 years,
Yes.
and I found the four walls of the classroom to be claustrophobic after several months on end. So what I enjoy is a more itinerant ministry. I do a lot of speaking and debating on university campuses all over North America and Europe. And then I will do just brief stretches of teaching for like 2 weeks, say, at Talbot School of Theology. And I enjoy that very much. It's constantly fresh. You're constantly meeting new people. And so that is the combination of traveling, speaking, and teaching that I have found really fulfills me.
William Lane Craig is my guest. We know him by Biola University's Talbot School of Theology. One last question, then I'm going to take a call or two in our remaining moments here. William, how did you get into debating? Is that something that you always were drawn to, or?
No, when I was a non-Christian and going to be a freshman in high school, my sister was 1 year ahead of me. And we argued all the time. And when I was in the 8th grade and she was a freshman in high school, she said, all you like to do is argue. You should join the debate team. And I said, what's that? And she said, oh, it's this debate club they have in high school. So when I went to high school the next year, I joined the freshman debate squad. And I loved it. And so I debated 4 years in high school and then 4 years on the intercollegiate level as a kind of intellectual sport. It wasn't a Christian ministry. We debated issues of public policy. But it was tremendous training that the Lord has subsequently used in unexpected ways.
Goodness gracious. What a wonderful story. Thank you for that. Johnny in Simi Valley, you're on the air with Dr. William Lane Craig. Thank you for calling, Johnny. We've got about 2 minutes here, if you could be brief with your question.
Oh, how are you doing, Mr. William Lane Craig?
I'm doing great.
Good. Great to talk to you. So I've been listening to a lot of Ravi Zacharias, Dr. Stephen C. Meyer, listening to a bunch of apologetics and philosophy on science, and I'm just looking for a really great way to start a conversation with my atheist and agnostic friends who really don't want to hear a lot about the gospel and Jesus and the Bible, but how can I really have a grounded conversation with them and be on almost like their level of communication and be able to kind of work the Bible into it and kind of challenging their worldview without necessarily offending them?
Yeah, I think a great way to do it is to talk about the origin of the universe and the fine-tuning of the universe. There was a commercial spot from Reasons to Believe just several minutes ago on this program where Hugh did a great job of describing the incredible fine-tuning of the universe that points to an intelligent designer of the cosmos. And the Big Bang Theory points to, I think, a creator of the cosmos. And these are neutral scientific facts. They're not from the Bible, but I think they point to a transcendent creator and designer beyond the universe who has brought it into being. And so this is something that non-believers are really interested in, especially if they have a scientific bent. So that's a great way to approach them.
Johnny, thank you for your phone call. If you would like to find out more about Dr. William Lane Craig, a wonderful website to go to and spend some time with is reasonablefaith.org, reasonablefaith.org. Dr. Craig, thank you for being on the program today, and if you ever want to take a long road trip, there's a warm seat across from me here in the Air Studio. In the interim, again, please accept my thanks, and I look forward to many, many more times on the air with you.
Great. It's been really fun, Frank. Thanks for having me on the program.
Thank you as well. God bless you.